There still is a lot of hesitation about a ceasefire. The Guild had already called for protecting journalists and for combatants in Israel specifically to respect the fact that journalists are protected by the Geneva Conventions.
Connor Lewis is the president of the Seven Mountains Central Labor Council. He is a member of the NewsGuild CWA. He won the presidency of the Labor Council on a campaign platform, a campaign promise to get an eighth mountain, is my understanding. Is that right?
Yeah, we're starting with the 8th and then maybe scaling out to the 9th, the 10th. Like the end goal is to have all the mountains, but we got to start small.
All of the mountains, moving them to the Seven Mountains Central Labor Council jurisdiction. So there you go.
One chain at a time.
One. That's right. And I haven't actually mentioned this on the show because this is the first show since this happened. But we are now, what's the word? We are now colleagues I don't know. I'm president of the Labor Council here is what I'm trying to say. So we are now
nice.
Both that.
Congratulations.
So thank you. So we're going to talk some more about your Labor Council stuff here in a second because you've been doing some really great stuff with the Labor Council up there and hoping to learn from what y'all have been doing both during this conversation and in future. But you reached out to us because you're a NewsGuild member, and there's a lot of organizing in the NewsGuild to call for a ceasefire. And there has been a lot of pushback in the NewsGuild, within the NewsGuild, and from without the NewsGuild, I think is my understanding. But more importantly, we're concerned with our fellow members and convincing them. And there's been a lot of pushback from within the Guild about objectivity. And so you have been doing a lot of reading and research and sharing a lot of this stuff about objectivity in the NewsGuild and how, the union has in the past kind of interpreted this journalistic ethic and how, they have interpreted it in maybe a different way than some people want to today. So talk to us a little bit about that, about why is a ceasefire important? I guess we can start there, just generally. Why would it be good for a ceasefire in Gaza to happen as you see it?
Well, I think that one of the key ways, looking at it from the perspective of the Guild as a union and why it's important for the Guild specifically to speak up here, this has been one of the deadliest conflicts. In fact, it is the deadliest conflict on record for media workers. The Committee to Protect Journalists first began tracking this in 1992, and there has been no conflict that has had more civilian casualties, including the entirety of the Iraq War, either one, or Afghanistan. Take your pick. And certainly in the Ukraine, there have not been nearly as many media workers killed as in Gaza in a very short span of time. And I believe that the number is over 50 media workers who have been killed overwhelmingly by Israeli airstrikes. This is a horrifying conflict for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that's really important in moments like this and, in times of war and in times of conflict is to actually have the ability to shine a light on what is happening on the ground. That was always the big difference in Vietnam that really changed, I think, American sentiment about America's role in the conflict was when images started coming back to Americans of what was happening in Vietnam, images of the coffins coming home, of those journalists actually shedding a light on the conduct of the war. And because of the deaths of journalists, media workers, et cetera, there are very few media workers and really no Western media workers on the ground in Gaza because they'll be killed. And which means that we don't have a good picture of what's occurring for the civilians in Gaza. We don't have a good picture of what the conflict looks like, except from, the brave journalists and media workers that have stayed on the ground and are reporting for outlets like Al Jazeera and some other outlets. And the consequence for American kind of knowledge and informing the American public about the conflict is pretty significant, because you'll see repeatedly, for example, CNN will say that X, Y, or Z is claimed to have happened by whatever source, including other media sources, with the final kind of footnote: CNN can't independently verify these. And so even when information is getting out there, it's with kind of an asterisk, because Western media can't actually verify the information that's being reported. I think that that's one of the reasons that I do journalism. And, there are newsroom reporters that would call me an advocacy journalist because I'm a labor journalist. And even among labor journalists, I'm not too shy about where my sympathies are.
Right.
But ultimately, one of the key roles of journalists is to be a voice for the people that don't have one, and to be skeptical of power, and to, tell these stories. And right now, media workers can't do that.
You mentioned in your Substack piece about this that actually one of the founders of the NewsGuild had a vision of journalism that was to right social wrongs, not to neutrally report the facts about just kind of random things, and inform people of what's going on. But one of the founders of the NewsGuild saw the purpose of journalism as to make the world better, to inform people about injustices so that they know how to fight them, right? Not just because, like, I don't know, this thing is happening, you decide, right? But he had a really particular view. Can you tell us about him?
So Haywood Brown, and I'm really interested to, I'm actually not certain if there are any biographies of him, but based on what I know, really interesting figure who was one of the most read columnists in the 1930s, and was a huge supporter of the New Deal, of progressive programs. I believe, not sure when or if he resigned his membership, but at least at one point was a member of the Socialist Party. He was one of the key founders of the NewsGuild, and he was actually doing it from a position of comparative privilege compared to a lot of newsroom employees who were incredibly just underpaid. And it was an interesting situation in the news industry, because typographers and a lot of the production workers were actually very, very heavily unionized. Almost all, pretty much all, I wouldn't say all, but very close to all newspapers had unionized typographers even through the 20s, when union density was fairly low. But in comparison, the newsroom employees that were doing the writing were paid less even sometimes than the typographers. And so, he was fairly well compensated because he was such a widely read, columnist, but he was very, very aware of the situation more generally in the news industry. And, it was a moment when particularly the idea of kind of neutrally reporting on what was happening in the country during the Great Depression really was kind of a farcical idea. And particularly, you had a lot of struggle in newsrooms between journalists that were basically being given editorial lines by their publishers, the William Randolph Hearst, the Chandlers of the world, that were incredibly opposed to the New Deal, opposed to the Roosevelt administration. They were actually struggling to have some kind of honest editorial, basically an honest editorial line on what was happening. And so it was a real kind of moment of upheaval in the newspaper industry generally, along with the rest of the country. And this is kind of where the NewsGuild was born. And it very quickly, within a span of a couple of years, really embraced a, very progressive militant, vision of unionism. It was originally founded independently. It briefly affiliated with the AFL in 1936, but by 1937, it left for the CIO. And, then they started talking about sending money to Spanish Republicans in, Spain. I mean, they were incredibly involved in social advocacy and political advocacy on a range of things, including domestic programs that directly impacted them, like the National Recovery Act and various, programs, but also, in court packing. Part of the, discussion of changing the Supreme Court, they were active in advocating for it. So, this was where the Guild came from, and, is kind of core to the Guild's identity.
And so what is the what's the counter argument, I guess? This is it really I have a difficult time kind of understanding why the counter argument is persuasive to some people, because it does seem to me that, like, yes, you want to be truthful, you want to say the truth, but the view from nowhere is kind of, it's strange to me, but the advocates of the view from nowhere are this objective approach. What are their arguments against a more of a principled kind of even activist journalism?
So, one thing that I think it's really important to emphasize is that the appeal to this kind of vision of, a radical objectivity, I'll say, as part of the kind of code of journalistic ethics, there were parallel moves toward correcting some of the issues with, like, the more sensational journalism that was prevalent in the early 20th century. But the use of it by employers and newspaper publishers has always been part of their business model, because they want to sell newspapers, and two, it's been a union busting tactic, and it has been since the Guild's inception. The American Newspaper Publishers Association, from the beginning of the Guild, argued that membership in the Guild would threaten a free press, because it would create an outside association, an outside entanglement that would, according to them, threaten any kind of hope of objectivity. And I mean, this was key to their strategy. And one of the reasons I know that is, my grandfather was a member of the Guild. My great-grandfather and his brother, Harvey Kelly, actually helped bust unions, and the Guild specifically, for the American Newspaper Publishers Association. My great-uncle was the chair of their special standing committee on labor relations for the entire newspaper industry. This was their strategy. It was to create the perception that being a good journalist and being a professional journalist was incompatible with being a union worker. And unfortunately, that's been internalized by a lot of journalists. And even though the Guild has kind of fought over that for decades and decades and decades, employers have still pushed these policies. The Guild hasn't always been successful in, chipping away at some of the more egregious restrictions on the freedom of journalists to act politically outside of their job. And, people are getting it in journalism schools. They're getting indoctrinated when the second they set foot into a J school. I taught a lot of University of Missouri journalism students, and they got it, from day one. And a lot of people, especially in the newspaper industry, the vast majority of reporters outside of some really prestigious publications are not particularly economically secure, just because of the general state of the newspaper industry. And so the risk of speaking up when you have all of these other pressures is scary. It's deeply scary. And then on the other hand, you have the very prestigious people, the senior folks at, prestigious publications that have kind of internalized this idea of, the consummate kind of, we're professionals, we're above these kinds of things, which they can do because they have a level of security and prestige that nobody else in the newspaper industry has. So, I mean, there's a lot of pressure on people to just kind of internalize this kind of concept of this kind of weird view from nowhere approach to journalism.
Right.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
And so that has been the argument from within the Guild to say no, we shouldn't endorse a ceasefire in Gaza at this point, right?
Pretty much, and it's come from primarily legacy newsrooms that are, again, comparatively, not saying that they don't have issues and that there aren't internal kind of hierarchies within those newsrooms, but these are ones where there's a little bit more prestige and there is a culture of fear with their management. I don't want to speak too much to what I've heard about the New York Times, working at the New York Times, but I wouldn't necessarily say that they're particularly respected or respected or supported by their management. And I would say the same at the Washington Post or any Reuters, Associated Press, any of these places. And there definitely is a strong editorial push for a certain sort of coverage on a lot of things, especially on Gaza. And it's difficult to push back against that, especially when you're in maybe a unit that hasn't really fought a ton over the past couple of decades.
Right.
It can be scary to take that step. I sympathize a lot with a lot of journalists who feel really torn between what they understand to be their professional obligations, employer pressures, and not having a history of that kind of collective action to be able to think, no, we can actually have our own voice in talking about this issue and what we want to do in talking about this issue. So it's a tough situation, and it's playing out in newsrooms, whether Guild or not, all over the country right now with coverage of Gaza.
And how is the campaign going? How did it start? The move to push the NewsGuild internationally to call for a ceasefire, and where does that campaign stand right now?
So, it initially started among rank and file members, some of whom are journalists, some of whom the Guild represents a lot of union staff and nonprofit workers as well, who are, very socially and politically engaged, is just part of their job, including, my local, the Washington Baltimore News Guild, represents the staff of Jewish Voice for Peace. So we represent some of the people on the front lines of fighting for a ceasefire. And, there's a tension between these newsrooms that, have this perception of what the Guild should do or shouldn't do because of their kind of viewpoint of journalism, and the reality that the Guild represents a lot more than just newsroom journalists. And it historically always has. It's never always been newsroom journalists. My grandfather worked in advertising. He had done some journalism, but he ended his career in the advertising department. And so, it started there and really started trying to have that discussion with the Executive Council. And one of the things that I will say, and this is just my viewpoint, is that the Guild has an incredible internal democracy. And I think that there are very few other unions, if any, where people raising this concern would be given a platform to speak directly to the Executive Council of the entire, international union within a couple of weeks, and to voice their concerns directly to the Executive Council. And it's something that I think is really, I value a lot about the Guild. There still is a lot of hesitation about, a ceasefire. The Guild had already called for protecting journalists and for the combatants in Israel specifically to respect the fact that journalists are protected by the Geneva Conventions. And they just recently reiterated that call, along with committing to financially supporting the International Federation of Journalists fund for reporters on the ground, most of whom it's going to mostly be going to Palestinian journalists, as well as, again, just reiterating the importance of protecting journalists as well. So it's still an ongoing discussion, and it's it's a deep, I'm not going to say fissure because I think that overstates it, but it's a deep question in the Guild about
Right.
what the relationship is between a journalist, what they view as their professional obligations, and the Guild as their union. And from my perspective, I think that even a journalist that believes in this kind of view of from nowhere kind of commitment can still support. And historically, that has been an argument that folks in the Guild have, embraced. You can commit to that in your day job while still supporting collective action through your union on political matters. And if anything, I would say that reemphasizes the importance of doing it as a union, because then it's not calling into question any individual journalists, political commitments, or they're not putting their name to something. It's right. Their union is standing up for something. So to me, it actually reemphasizes the importance of, if you want to take a stand and you believe it's important, then do it through your union. But it's an ongoing discussion that's going to have to keep continuing. And honestly, has a lot bigger implications, I think, for a view of what people want the Guild to be, as one of the most, militant and pound for pound, it's done some of the most organizing of any union in the country over the past, 6, 7, 8 years. It's enormous amounts of organizing. And I think that, there needs to be a discussion about what is our vision of what the Guild should be? And I think that that's a conversation. I have my opinions, but, I think that that's something that the membership needs to really kind of figure out. And it's a conversation that I think is really happening in a productive way right now, precipitated by, the debate over the ceasefire.
Jacob, I was just going to jump in real quick to say that what you just described and those kind of conversations that are happening, and in some cases, I'm hearing that from other people in other unions as well, where this sort of internal organizing around this issue is happening. And I talked to a brother yesterday who told me that it's actually brought a lot of his coworkers and union members together in a new way. People that didn't normally talk to each other, or maybe weren't normally very engaged in the union, are now all working together in solidarity for this effort, and are really, building some relationships that hopefully will gain steam and lead to just more positive transformation all around.
Connor, there's on the electoral front, AIPAC has been making a lot of moves to try to discourage any elected officials from weighing in, against Israeli aggression on behalf of Palestinian, justice and peace for them. And it was mentioned in the chat by MIDI doctors, concern about if AIPAC is going to be kind of wading into these waters with against the NewsGuild and similar. I saw similar worries on Twitter about the UAW after the UAW International called for a ceasefire. There was somebody expressing concern about how this would affect the new Stand Up 2.0 campaign to organize non-union workers. Is there any indication that institutionalized Israeli support groups like AIPAC are going to be wading into this on the labor front?
I haven't seen any. I think it's a real concern, and I think that there have been glimpses of outside groups interfering in internal union matters, or going after unions on social issues for some time now. I think that my viewpoint would be that were that to happen, I would hope that every labor union, every labor leader, regardless of their viewpoints individually and institutionally on the question of a ceasefire, would categorically fight any attempt to attack the labor movement for decisions reached by individual unions, as well as attack any attempt to interfere in internal union democracy. And I would say that from my perspective, that is a categorical red line that the labor movement should maintain, that our internal democracy and our internal deliberations are our own. Outside interference in those is categorically off limits. And, ultimately you can disagree with where we end up as an outcome of that democratic process, but you don't get to attack the process itself. Because I think that that's a really important red line in maintaining internal union democracy, because otherwise, it can get, it opens potential floodgates for outside domination of internal union life. And I would say that, I don't know in any kind of detail all of AIPAC's donors, but there are definitely some large ones that I can think of that also are owners of businesses that employ union workers. And I would say that, if they start getting involved in anything internal with unions or trying to influence the internal direction of union discussions, I would say that there's some major legal concerns there that the Department of Labor should be looking into, because it's categorically illegal for companies or anyone that employs, union workers or employs workers in an industry that labor is trying to organize, to interfere in internal union matters. And
well,
so
I think that,
I would say that,
I think that would be definitely an issue. Trying to sway members one way or another, or antagonize them against their leadership for this. But I think what comes to my mind immediately would be, AIPAC running commercials in Huntsville, targeted at Toyota workers, saying, because the way that AIPAC has been fighting the politicians that they don't like has not been, look, they hate Israel, right? Because people don't, really working people don't care about that. It's just not something that most working people, you say the UAW called for a ceasefire in Gaza. Okay, that's fine. I don't care. That's even, it'll range from like ambivalence to neutrality to good, in most cases. In more cases than in more cases, UAW called for a ceasefire is going to elicit a good emotion than a bad emotion, right? So, but that's not how they're attacking the politicians. They're just saying they're not good Democrats for totally different reasons, right? They're not even going after them on the question of Israel at all. It's totally different reasons, just general anti-ads towards these, against these politicians. And so my potential concern would be, AIPAC running a commercial here, on the radio or on Facebook targeted at Huntsville Toyota workers saying, UAW bad, right? Not UAW's pro-Palestine, but UAW bad. And similar for NewsGuild, as y'all are organizing news shops and stuff like that. That would be, I think, the kind of the concern that would come to the front of my mind. But I, like you, I haven't seen any indication that's on the horizon.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately, if it's not them, it's going to be someone else. And even better than me, the role that right-wing politicians have played in attacking, UAW's past campaigns in the South. In Tennessee, the company was technically neutral in Chattanooga, but they could claim that because they knew the politicians were going to do the dirty work for them. Right. So, from my perspective, look, they're going to pull that. They can pull that. I think that that's really not going to be particularly more, damaging than just any other aspect of a typical boss campaign. I guess the only difference would be that they got a lot of money to pour into it. Yep. But again, I would be very curious, and this is something I don't know. At what point does an outside group trying to influence the outcome of a union election start to interfere with the right of workers to have, the NLRB under the current NLRB, they're very big on laboratory conditions for, without any kind of scare tactics or anything like that. I would be very curious to know, how that could impact the elections, how they could be held accountable for that, or, if employers that if I were an employer looking at the current NLRB and looking at the standard for elections right now, I'd try to warn off anyone that thinks they're trying to help me, because I don't want to get the NLRB to say that no, that was that tainted the election. We're just going to issue a bargaining order. So I'm not sure what possibility there is to do that when you have outside kind of messengers kind of paying to influence a union election. But I think that there are probably more ways that it could blow up in their face than ways that it can hurt organized labor if they try to go that route.
From your lips to God's ears, if I am a NewsGuild CWA member and I want to sign on to the call to push the National Union to call for a ceasefire, where do I need to go?
Well, that is a very good question, and I wish I had a clear answer. I should have had one prepped, but I think that the best way to for just the meantime is that you can on Twitter. I'm not going to call it whatever the hell it is. You can follow the. I'm actually going to look up the account as we speak. I'm kind of riffing here. You can follow the Twitter account at CWA _4, that's the number 4 _ Palestine. And that's a good kind of point of reference. It has open DMs, I think, so you can DM that account and ask for some more information. And it's also got a link tree that goes to a variety of different things, including, donations to journalists in Gaza and that kind of thing. So that would probably be the best kind of initial point, would be to follow the Twitter account CWA _ 4 _ Palestine.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.